the breaking point when the witch hunt antics of special counsel Robert Mueller saw his office releasing heavily redacted U.S. federal court documents seeming to allege that President Donald Trump had committed a crime by his violating election campaign laws to pay hush money to two of his former female sexual companions. Immediately upon these redacted documents released, the entire leftist socialist mainstream propaganda media establishment erupted in a demonic orgy of calls for President Donald Trump to be immediately thrown out of office, with their declaring that, quote, democracy is at stake if the Democrats don't pursue impeachment, unquote. A call soon joined by Democratic Party leader, U.S. Congressman Adam Shifty Schiff, who laughably claimed that President Donald Trump might face the real prospect of jail time, and Democratic Party leader, U.S. Congressman Jerry Nadler, who likewise comically claimed that President Donald Trump's hush money payments are impeachable offenses, neither of whom, though, voiced any opposition to the U.S. Congress paying out $17 million in the past 10 years for unwanted sexual advances by unnamed lawmakers. A hypocritical oath, no doubt. If President Donald Trump indeed paid hush money to anyone to keep hidden his sexual indiscretions, this report explains the U.S. Federal Election Commission had already determined that hush money paid by political office candidates to cover up torrid affairs did not need to be reported in the campaign's financial disclosure reports. A ruling that was made in favor of U.S. presidential candidate John Edwards, who was being persecuted by the Obama-Clinton regime for the exact same, quote, hush money issue Trump is now being accused of, and who was acquitted of all the made-up charges against him. As to this general issue of any U.S. political candidate violating campaign election laws, this report further explains that President Donald Trump's paying around $280,000 in hush money is dwarfed into virtual insignificance by President Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, being found guilty of violations involving nearly $2 million. Barely reported, obviously, by the mainstream media, and that saw the Obama Justice Department deciding not to pursue with their instead quietly disposing of this real crime with a $375,000 fine levied against Obama by the U.S. Federal Elections Commission. Even though the leftist socialist mainstream propaganda media establishment won't honestly report to the American people the vast election campaign financial crimes committed by Barack Obama and covered up by his own Justice Department, this two-tiered system of justice pummeling President Donald Trump isn't being lost on his loyal supporters, obviously, and is why Independent Party U.S. Senator Angus King stated and warned the Democrats that if impeachment of President Donald Trump is moved forward on the current evidence, quote, at least a third of the country would think it was just political revenge and a coup against the president, unquote. And, as warned by the U.S. Senator King, most to be feared about these tens of millions of loyal Donald Trump supporters raging against the Democratic coup against him, this report details, is that they're mirroring the national populist Yellow Vest rebellion currently embroiling France, and today sees calls going out throughout America today urging Donald Trump supporters to learn from these yellow jackets and stop running and start fighting back. But unlike in France, these loyal Donald Trump supporters are armed to the teeth. With President Donald Trump just a week ago stating that he was prepared to cut defense spending, this report explains that the growing rage of his loyal supporters and events in France cause him to reverse course and propose a staggering increase to $750 billion for the American military, with President Donald Trump reported to be most appalled and alarmed when globalist armored vehicles bearing the EU flag began appearing in the streets of France to squash protesters, and whose appearance stoked fear and confusion as the EU doesn't have any army that anyone knows about, as rather than bearing the French tricolored flag. These vehicles bore the distinct stare of the EU flag and a sign an EU army is drawing closer to existence, with it further being noted, quote, "So now we have combat-ready armored vehicles with the EU flag which are being used against unarmed European protesters who are demonstrating against a pro-EU authoritarian regime. Do you still think the EU is a protect for peace organization?" While the massive defeat of French President Macron by his own nation's citizens is ringing alarm bells throughout Europe, the French capital of Paris is now, for all intent purposes, the front line in a growing struggle against neoliberalism and its bastard child, austerity, across a European Union whose foundations are crumbling, and that are crumbling not due to the devilish machinations of President Putin, but instead as the result of a neoliberal status quo that provides far too few with unending comfort and material prosperity at the expense of far too many, for whom dire misery and mounting pain are its grim fruits. In defense and intelligence experts knowing how this global revolt against leftist socialism is now centering itself in President Trump's America, it is no wonder that martial law has to be imposed before the United States tears itself completely apart, with the only question remaining to be asked is whom the U.S. military will be rolling their armored war vehicles against: President Trump's Christian loyalists or godless democratic leftist socialists, but whose clue of was issued this past summer by QAnon leader U.S. General Mark Milley, who told his nation's military forces, quote, "The duty of soldiers and officers is to the U.S. Constitution, not any political party or figure," unquote, with his further declaring to anyone able to understand, quote, "We are the only military in the world that does not take an oath to a king, a queen, a dictator, a president. We don't take an oath to a country and to itself. We don't take an oath to a tribe or a piece of dirt. The very core of essence of the United States military is that we are committed to you, the citizens. We are willing to die, to give our lives for an idea," unquote.
Tens of thousands of protesters flooding the streets of France for the fourth weekend in a row.
In Paris, more than 1,300 people arrested, more than 100 others were hurt. The riots sparked by rising fuel taxes initially that now have this country in panic mode.
Well, here to weigh in is Nigel Farage, former United Kingdom Party leader, European Parliament member, and a Fox News contributor. Nigel, we're so happy to have you this morning to talk about this really important issue. Good morning. All right, so we just experienced the fourth weekend of protests in a row in Paris. They've now spread to the Netherlands and Belgium, and it seems like the anger is all over the governments not really representing the people. Some of the protesters feel that they're making decisions that benefit the rich and leaving them behind. Is that an accurate assessment of what's going on in Europe right now?
Yeah, I mean, President Macron comes from the intellectual, wealthy Parisian elite. He's a huge supporter of the European project, of globalism in general. He thinks putting up taxes on fuel is a terribly good idea. And I think, it was sparked over green taxes, these protests, but actually it is a feeling that those that are governing France have no comprehension, no understanding of the struggling lives of ordinary people. And the French, well, they're an extraordinary country because all through their history, you see these sort of violent demonstrations and revolutions. The last big one was in 1968, and it led to General de Gaulle, the president, losing his position. This one, you get the impression sometimes that it's just Paris. It isn't. This is happening in every major city in France. Macron today realizes that he's in trouble. He's going to come back with some tax concessions for the lower paid, and we'll see whether that stops it.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see what he has to say. You know, it feels like it's about more than that. Throughout, I think, a lot of middle and lower class communities in the world, it's just getting harder and harder to get by financially. Yeah. Everything gets more and more expensive. How do we combat that?
Yeah, well, as you say, the rich get richer, and those people out there working are struggling. My own view is that we've gone in the Western world for an economic model that is so heavily regulated at every single level that we drive business towards the big companies by making it so difficult, you know, for men and women trying to run their own little companies. We have to do something to help the self-employed. We have to do something to help those people who operate out there on their own, because at the moment they have to deal with the same regulation as a giant multinational. Something in that regard has to change. That at least would be a beginning.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Let's talk about a sort of under-discussed aspect of the story, in my opinion. You know, I understand that these protesters are angry with Macron's policies, but if these riots were taking place in the United States, these protesters would be criticized for destroying the very country they say they want to make better. I mean, they've already caused $1 billion worth of damage. I'm sure they've affected hundreds of small businesses. There have been fatalities. So your response to that criticism?
Yeah, it's a fair point. And of course, don't forget, this is happening just before Christmas. The centre of Paris has been closed down for some days. Tourism, I mean, are people going to, you know, on the off chance, would you now go to Paris for your Christmas break? Well, the answer is you wouldn't. So economically, it's very, very damaging. But here's the extraordinary thing. The extraordinary thing is, despite the violence, something like 70% of French people think these protests are right. They think Macron represents an out-of-touch globalist elite. And really, what they're now trying to do is to bring down the president